Welcome back, everybody. Just a quick little intro this week. As we mentioned last week, no DVD or Blu-ray reviews this week, but I did have the chance to talk with Paul Benedict Rowan for an hour. He is an Irish journalist who wrote the book Making Ryan's Daughter, The Myths, Madness, and Mastery, which is available right now on Amazon, and you can get it Kindle or paperback. It's an amazing book. It's almost 320 pages of the story of the making of the movie that nearly ended David Lean's career. And, Tim, that was such an interesting period. I mean, it was 1970, 69, 70, and all those old guard directors were going away. They were kind of breathing their last gasp.
Yeah, the studio system itself was changing. You had the young bucks coming in. You had actors, movie stars setting up their own production companies and taking over studios in some cases. And the powers that had been for the previous 35 years, 40 years, were slipping away.
Yeah, it's a fascinating moment. There's so many good parts of the book, which is not just about the filmmaking. It's not just about going to Ireland and this movie that took over a year to shoot, and the bad weather, and spending weeks at a time waiting to shoot 10 seconds. It's not just that. It's about how MGM as a company was changing, and how even during the course of this year plus of shooting, there was all this turbulence going on. I mean, I learned so much reading this book. It's a really good book. So without further ado, here is my interview with Paul Benedict Rowan on his book, Making Ryan's Daughter, The Myths, Madness, and Mastery. It is my enormous privilege today to be talking with Paul Benedict Rowan, the author of Making Ryan's Daughter, The Myths, Madness, and Mastery, which is one of the most remarkable making-of movie books I've read in a very, very long time. Just as a quick introduction, Paul Benedict Rowan is an Irish journalist, and he has written for the BBC World Service, and he has been a regular writer for the Sunday Times for the better part of the last two decades, writing on sports and news and everything else. And Paul, talk about, I mean, Ryan's Daughter, just to sort of preface it for people, it was almost David Lean's last film. As it turned out, it wound up being his second to last film, but it took him more than a decade to get around to making A Passage to India. And Ryan's Daughter just came around right at a sea change in the history of the movies, when everything was kind of leaving the 50s and 60s behind and moving into the grittier and more rough and tumble 70s. And all the old school directors were sort of being left behind. And Lean was coming off of his greatest success in Dr. Zhivago, with two Best Picture winners prior to that, Bridge on the River Kwai and Lawrence of Arabia. How could Ryan's Daughter fail? And yet fail it did. And the backstory to it lends so much information into that. How did you come up? Obviously, it ties in. If you're Irish, you know a great deal about Ryan's Daughter. It's kind of a legendary shoot. But talk about what led you to do this, because you did these interviews over a very long period of time.
Yeah, I even going back to the last millennium. If 1999, I kind of started my work on researching the book, and really there was an intense period over the turn of the millennium where I did most of my interviews. I traveled to Los Angeles to speak to some people over there, do some research. I live in London, so all the technical crew who worked on Ryan's Daughter, a lot of them were still living within a sort of a 50-mile radius of London. Most of them were kind of retired and had time to sit down and reflect on that extraordinary 18 months or so that some of them spent in Dingle in County Kerry in Ireland making that film, all the way back in 1969. Some of them that were there from 1968 to 1970. So it was epic in lots of different ways. And so I obviously, I as a journalist, my curiosity was pricked, I suppose, by visiting Kerry and hearing the stories about Hollywood coming to rural Ireland in the late 60s, which was a very, I don't want to use the word backward, but it was a it was a place still back in the 30s, really, in lots of different ways. Like there would only just have been sort of, they recently would have only had television there, and electricity would have been only a sort of it would have been there for about 10 years. So very simple kind of peasant kind of lifestyle most people
Well,
lived.
and you even say in the book that everything had to they still didn't have direct dialing. They had to go through the switchboard. There was only one black and white television at the Skellig Hotel, which only the television came on at 5 p.m. with children's shows and went for a couple of hours and ended with Bewitched. I mean, you really depict very much the how many decades behind they were from what we sort of normally associate with the rest of the world.
Yeah, I suppose probably direct dialing in the States would have been well in at that stage, and probably a large part of the rest of the Western world. But in Dingle, if you wanted to get through to Robert Mitchum's place, it was still, you had to go through the operator who'd stitch it through. It was, his number would have been something like Dingle 58 or something like that, or Dingle 1 or something, like, it was as simple as that. So and she might listen in as well while you were having your conversation with the great man.
Right.
But yeah, so yeah, I mean, as I say, Dingle was it was a kind of it was really a small Irish town that was steadily declining from its peak, which was really going back to maybe a couple of centuries before. Really, they depended a lot for their income on emigres in the US sending back money, and then some of them would have lived off handouts, done a bit of farming, done a bit of this, done a bit of that, done a bit of fishing. And then, so when Ryan's daughter came along, it was like manna from heaven. The Faraway Productions, the David Lean's company, which made the film, were paying kind of 10 times the rates that these people were normally used to. And Ryan's daughter people were quite clever. They really got the locals on side by employing them, for one thing, and by spending their money in Dingle on in the shops and stuff, in the pubs as well, lots of it. And so they kept the money local, and local people loved them for that. They could have brought in outside people to do all the supplies, but they didn't. They had plenty of money, as you say, after Doctor Zhivago, which was certainly probably Lean's most profitable film. A lot of people would say it wasn't one of his better films, but Lean made money hand over fist on that movie. Um, Lean could do no wrong really coming into Ryan's daughter, even though, as you said in your intro there, the movie times were changing. A lot of the MGM was doing quite badly financially at the time, and they were seen to be old-fashioned and making a lot of old-fashioned movies, and Ryan's daughter kind of fitted into that category. They had a lot of upheaval in MGM at the time. There was 3 or 4 different owners, 3 or 4 different presidents coming in, all trying to rescue the company, all trying to get a bit of the glamour of Tinseltown. These were guys who had previously worked like Seagrams, like Bronfman, Edgar Bronfman. He ran Seagrams, but
Yeah.
they all seemed to be attracted to the film industry, even though some of them knew little or nothing about it. And eventually, it was Kirk Kerkorian who you'll know, who took over MGM and brought in a guy called Jim Aubrey, the Smiling Cobra, who was just a kind of a cost cutter and a slasher, and basically no movie was going to cost over $1 or $2 million to make. And Ryan's daughter, even at that stage, was heading into being a $15 million movie, but it was too late for Aubrey. He stopped a lot of movies at the time being made. Zinnemann's movie Man's Fate was axed, even though the sets had already been built on Pinewood Studios, and Kubrick's Napoleon that was iced as well. So Lean was far enough down the tracks so that Aubrey couldn't stop him, and MGM as well. They were hoping that Ryan's daughter was going to really kind of save the company. That was the feeling at the time.
Wow.
Hmm.
And your own fascination with this. I mean, you've committed a lot of time over the years to this story. What does it mean to you personally?
Good question. I would like Wade. Unlike you, you probably maybe love the film. I love the film in terms of the scenery and the landscape and all the rest of it. I see some of the problems, and I can see why a lot of people didn't like it. But I suppose it wasn't from watching the film that I would have been become, I suppose, obsessed about Ryan's daughter. It was really from hearing the stories about how it was made and all that. And
Hmm.
I wouldn't have really regarded myself as a film buff, probably unlike you. I come just more from a kind of a journalistic background in terms of spotting a good story and running with it. Can take me anywhere really. And so yeah, but the more I researched it, the more I became kind of I suppose kind of in love with some of the figures, even though they were dead at this stage. Like I think I kind of fell in love with Mitchum, and I kind of fell in love with Lean as well. And I just had massive respect for them in terms of what they, reading up what they'd achieved in their careers, coming from completely different perspectives. And they didn't really get on, but I think they had a lot of respect for each other at the same time. And yeah, I suppose it was also fascinating in that I was exploring. Once I started doing the research, I met a lot of really kind of fascinating and kind of colorful personalities. People who worked in the film industry who are who had a lot of they were great, as I say, great characters and had great stories to tell and were strong personalities. Didn't mind calling it as it was. Didn't mind necessary if necessary criticizing David Lean, even though they would have had a massive respect for him. So I was getting a level of frankness about from my research that I was really kind of thrilled by. Like I went to see the producer Anthony Havelock Allen, who he lived in sort of West London, kind of a nice Georgian house there. And he spoke to me for 90 minutes or so, even though he was getting close to 100. His mind was still sharp as a tack, really. And he kind of lambasted the film and lambasted Mitchum and was very critical of David Lean, even though Lean was a great friend of his. And even though Anthony Havelock Allen made a lot of money out of Ryan's daughter himself, and it's probably his biggest credit that he had in his long career. So yeah, it was just it was really refreshing meeting all these kind of curious characters who I hadn't really entered that milieu before. And I found people so helpful, and I'm not trying to sound sycophantic here, but people like David Lean's biographer, Kevin Brownlow, he kind of just basically opened his library and said, take what you want, really, and it was just an extraordinary level of generosity. So yeah, so the more I kind of researched it, the more the fonder I grew of the whole film and everything around it, really. And I think the book is quite critical. Lean made a lot of wrong decisions in terms of when he made the movie, and there was probably they probably didn't do their homework properly in terms of the Irish weather, how it was going to mess around with the schedule and all the rest of it. But I hope that my respect for Lean and the others comes across in the book.
It does very much, and what I most love about the book, because I've read all the existing, I've read Adrian Turner's biography of Bolt, I've read Brownlow's biography, but Brownlow's been very, very kind with me as well. When I've needed some things, he's been a wonderful resource. I know Steven Silverman, who wrote the original Lean bio, and of course I've read Eddie Fowley's dedicated maniac memoirs, and they
Yeah,
all paint a picture. But your book fills in all the blanks. I feel as though it's they all just provided the mortar, but you've provided the bricks as far as this film is concerned.
yeah, I definitely.
And the thing is, when you talk,
Go on. Sorry. Yeah, keep going.
no, I was going to say really quickly that Ryan's daughter does kind of get short shrift because obviously it's the film that of his latter part of the career that doesn't stand out. Of his last five films, it's the only one that wasn't nominated for Best Picture and Best Director and all of that, and so
It's
they
the
tend to sort of
it's the
skirt
it's the
past it.
runt.
But I think it's a real cautionary tale.
Yeah, it's kind of considered to be the runt and the litter, isn't it? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
which is really, really unfair on it. Like, and that sounds a bit flippant, but really that's the reality. I mean, like as you pointed out there, Lean was on an incredible, you know, winning streak. Going from when he turned to Hollywood to make his movies, which really was Bridge on the River Kwai back in the late 50s, when Sam
Yeah.
Spiegel basically commissioned him to shoot that film, which they shot in Ceylon. It was called, as it was called at the time, Sri Lanka. And that was a kind of a test for David Lean. Could he hack it? In the jungle, and by God, he could. He thrived in that kind of environment. And then he went on to even excel himself even more by making Lawrence of Arabia in Jordan and elsewhere in the desert. Incredibly difficult film to shoot, and huge logistics and all sorts of problems. But these movies were all incredibly successful. Doctor Zhivago, they all. I mean, I think by the time I think they'd won something like 19 Oscars. Those three films um,
Yeah.
alone, and then so he was coming into Ryan's Daughter, as I say. So, I hope I haven't forgotten the question you asked me originally there, Wade. But
Well, where I was going with this was that people tend to overlook it or pass over it because it's
yeah,
not one of the great exclamation points in his career. But
exactly.
what I love in this book is that right now we are going through kind of another sea change in the entertainment business. Studios are consolidating, streamers are coming up. Obviously, the pandemic has exacerbated a lot of these things, and people are wondering what's the future of movies. Very much a question they were asking in 1969 and 70. And so I see certain parallels in reading the book.
Mm,
For example, and we should point out too that this was shot on the Dingle Peninsula in southwestern Ireland, which, as you point out in the book, is as far west as you can go in Europe, unless you count Iceland. It is
mm,
it is the furthest western part. It's there's these little kind of wind whipped fingers down there in lower Ireland, and it sticks right out there. And all of that stuff would have been done by CGI today. They wouldn't have built an entire village. They would have just created it on a computer. So there's something
yeah.
really rustic and pioneering about this story that is very, very cautionary for today too.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because the actors there is a dispute which is the most western point of Europe. It depends how you read the whatever it is. It's either Portugal or it's Dingle Peninsula. But Dingle is the closest place in Europe to America. So it's got a
Hmm.
special resonance in that sense. Um, uh, but like for instance, well, they they were trying to shoot a storm scene in Ryan's Daughter, and of course nowadays they'd be able to kind of use CGI and all the rest of it. Um, Pre Ryan's Daughter, before Ryan's Daughter, a lot of storm scenes were getting shot in studios using kind of massive tanks and all that kind of thing. So for a lot of the sea scenes, Trevor Howard, who himself and John Mills were involved in a very nasty accident while trying to row a currach into a beach while shooting one of the scenes. They got hit by a wave and knocked out of the boat, and they were badly sort of shaken up. And John Mills was unconscious for a little while, and it was too dangerous. It was very very dangerous shoot. And sort of Howard was complaining afterwards. He was said in the old days we would have shot that in the studio, with in a tank, and then of course and then you read it and you think, well, yeah, and now these days they would have CGI'd virtually that whole thing. So
Sure.
Lean was looking for this incredible level of authenticity that only someone like him, with his status, could really kind of demand from the studios, that they give him the time, and the money to take as long as he liked, really, to make that movie. And nobody could tell him to hurry up. Nobody could really sort of crack the whip, because he simply wouldn't do it. And so yeah, it's extraordinary film to watch in that sense. They had to wait and wait and wait and wait for the storm. Like they were told that there would be plenty of storms. That they'd be sick of the amount of storms they'd get, and they didn't get any storm. there was supposed to in the winter of 68, 69 was Ireland was becalmed. It was stormless. And so what they did was, when they were expected to shoot the storm scenes during that, they kept the actors in Dingle virtually for a whole year, waiting for the next winter and next summer, next winter for the storms to, so a lot of the Irish actors spent the whole year in Dingle, literally in the pub, or trying to stay out of the pub, just waiting and waiting and waiting for a storm. And so the costs sort
It's
of
just
escalated,
amazing.
rocketed, and of course, they were all they couldn't they were all sort of they had to stay within a sort of 20-mile radius of Dingle, in case suddenly that they were called to get before the camera. So so it became a very kind of cloistered environment in Dingle, and they almost became like kind of gossipy villagers themselves in a way. And they were gossiping with each other and sort of having affairs and everything else, um, and going, having wild parties, and the local people were kind of agog at what was happening on their doorsteps, really. So
Well,
yeah,
you have so many wonderful stories in there, and I won't spoil any of it for our listeners whom I'm going to encourage to definitely read it. But in the accident that you just mentioned with Trevor Howard and John Mills, when the boat overturned, you have a wonderful line in there describing the local physician and why John Mills did not want to go see him. And I think it's a beautiful turn of the phrase, and it's part of what I think makes the book so fun to read. Speaking of the parties, I mean, I reading about Robert Mitchum grabbing his German hunting knife and chasing a local around the rented mansion of Robert
yeah.
Bolt and Sarah Miles, I laughed. You have so many great anecdotes in there.
Well, you know who showed me that knife? Because I went to Spain. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the technical crew were sort of scattered around London. Um, some of them were also in Spain. Because that's where Lean had made Doctor Zhivago. He made Doctor Zhivago. He shot Doctor Zhivago, obviously a film based in Russia. He built Moscow on a set outside of Madrid, and so Doctor Zhivago was shot almost entirely in Spain. And he really and Lean loved working in Spain. He loved. I think he was, his politics didn't, he wouldn't have been as extreme as General Franco, who was the Spanish dictator at the time, but his politics would he would have been comfortable enough there. So some of his technical crew came from Spain. So I went to Madrid, and I went down to see Eddie Fowley, who was living in this very southeastern tip of Spain, a place called Carboneras, where they filmed Lawrence of Arabia, when they moved out of Jordan. So Eddie Fowley, Lean's man Friday, his kind of right hand man, was still living in Carbonara. So I went to see him, and then I went up to Madrid to see a guy called Pedro Vidal. Pedro was the first assistant director on Ryan's Daughter, and he brought me into his small apartment in Madrid, and he started showing me some mementos, including, he pulls out this big knife, and he said, this is the knife. This is the Robert Mitchum's the knife that he sold me, and it was a beautiful piece of German engineering, I suppose you might call it. And it was a Puma White Hunter knife, a deadly weapon, a beautiful. And he said, Robert Mitchum sold me this for a penny after I expressed my admiration for it, and that was really extraordinary. That extraordinary moment, actually, in my research when I saw that, and that linked in then with the
There's a
story about the party when some local idiot kind of poked Mitchum in the eye, um, and Mitchum went out. Mitchum's eye was bloodshot, but he said it went out to his car. He was enraged. He went out to his Porsche and he got his knife and he came looking for the guy, but thankfully he didn't find him. The guy had scarpered. A lot of the locals wanted they loved Mitchum. Most of them. Mitchum used to walk around Dingle, like, do his shopping. Like, Mitchum was on call like everybody else, waiting and waiting and waiting and waiting, and he was going crazy. Like, he thought he'd have the opportunity to go to sort of take breaks in London, where he knew lots of people, and even go back to LA, to see his family and stuff. like he went to LA. He basically looked at the contract. He looked at the script, and he said, "I'll be able to take certain breaks here." And they said, "Oh yeah, you can go away for a couple of weeks." And I don't tell this story as well as Robert Mitchum tells it, and I won't even try to put on the English accents that Robert Mitchum puts on. But anyway, he gets home to his family home in Bel Air. Next minute, the phone rings. We need you back. Straight away. He's only just come in the door, so he has to fly back to Dingle. And then he doesn't work for 2 weeks, 3 weeks. He's just kept waiting again because the weather is rubbish or whatever. So he's just going absolutely stir crazy in Dingle, and he builds up a kind of resentment towards the producer, particularly. Um, and towards Lean. He blamed both of them for making his life so miserable, um, and he didn't hold back, particularly when it came to dealing with the producer. Sure.
I think there's a really interesting lesson to be gleaned here to kind of come back to that, and just to sort of set the stage a little bit for listeners who may not be that familiar with the film, which is not yet on Blu-ray, hopefully soon. But it was also the first film in a very long time that was from an original script for Lean. It was something that Robert Bolt had written loosely based on Madame Bovary originally and set in France, specifically as a vehicle for Sarah Miles, whom he had just married and who was 17 years his junior, and who was kind of an up and coming actress who had done a few things, including Joseph Losey's The Servant. And Robert Bolt obviously wanted to make a star out of his wife, and I think. Reading your book, it seemed I think you more or less make the same point that there's a certain degree of cockiness that Bolt and Lean had coming off of their successes with Lawrence and Dr. Zhivago, thinking that here they had adapted prior material and had these two great successes, that they could do no wrong. And they sat down together in Rome and fleshed out this script and moved it from France to Ireland, and kind of took a small story and turned it into a grand epic, and perhaps didn't realize that much of what their prior success had been was inherited from the pre-existing material, that perhaps they could not and should not necessarily generate something purely from scratch, because it would bring out all of their own worst impulses unrestrained by pre-existing material. Would you say that that's perhaps a fair assessment?
Yeah, I think so. Well, maybe slightly harsh on Bolt, and um, in that Bolt would have been a pretty creative guy who could generate his own material rather than just adapting Seven Pillars of Wisdom as he did for Lawrence of Arabia. Um, and then he basically for Dr. Zhivago he had to distill the book, you know, which is a
Which
kind of
is huge,
sprawling
yeah.
epic, and he said it was like trying to straighten cobwebs. Um, so he was kind of sick of doing that. Really, I think he that's what he said anyway at the time. He said, "I don't want to do any more of this, this sort of stuff." Um, and uh, they look they tried to pass off Ryan's Daughter as a totally original film, but and most people accepted it as such. And then afterwards they said, "Oh, we fooled you. It was actually Madame Bovary dressed up in a slightly different context, different time, in a different country, etc., etc." Um, but yeah, they they I suppose they were. Lean was a fierce romantic. He didn't like Bolt's original script, which was Madame Bovary, and just a straightforward adaptation of Madame Bovary. He didn't like it particularly, but Lean had just fallen in love with a young woman himself, who became his fifth wife. He was married at the time to an Indian woman, and then when he was in India, he met yeah, I suppose you might call them he met a kind of a Western woman who was born in India to Swiss parents, young girl. She was Sandy Lean. She was Sandy Hoth. She was 20 years of age. So he kind of he came to Dingle with his young girlfriend. Really, everyone kind of assumed it was probably his wife. Um, and so he kind of originally dismissed Bolt's picture, Bolt's screenplay, not screenplay, Bolt's script, because he thought Bolt's sort of fallen for this Sarah Miles woman, and he's kind of he's kind of lost it. He's lost the plot a bit, and then sure enough, Lean then loses the plot by falling in love with a young girl himself. So that's what the kind of film is about. It's about kind of whether an older man stayed in his ways can satisfy a young woman in terms of her expectations and what she wants out of life. Um, and so that was what that's what part of what Ryan's Daughter is about. It's about a young girl growing up and trying to wrestle with with becoming a woman in a kind of a very kind of you might say kind of a where she doesn't have any empathy from the local people. So she marries this person who she thinks is the man of her dreams, but he's not. I mean, this is what happens in the film. Without I'm not giving the plot away. It's 50 years made 50 years ago. So Robert Mitchum was playing the older man, who's basically a bit of a flop in bed, essentially. Can't really satisfy Rosie in that department, and then she goes and runs off and had an affair with, of all people, a British army officer, the occupying forces who the local people hate. So then you have this kind of forbidden love aspect to the story. So so it was it didn't really have that kind of epic quality though that say Zhivago or Lawrence Arabia had, that which kind of spread across kind of almost like generations and involved kind of epic kind of battles and conflicts, and they were genuinely epic
Yeah.
material. Ryan's Daughter was really just a kind of a small love story. Um, like Leo McKern, who played the part of Ryan, the publican, the father of Rosie Ryan, Ryan's daughter. He said it was like a women's magazine story, really, which was
Hmm.
meant as a criticism, and certainly came across as a strong criticism. So yeah, but Lean was, as the producer said, a part of the criticisms from Anthony Havelock Allen was that of Lean was that Lean was sort of in epic mode, and he couldn't kind of snap out of it. He just couldn't, and he kind of fell in love with the kind of rugged Irish countryside. So it was this small little love story packaged in this enormous kind of vistas of landscapes, and some people said that the characters kind of became kind of microscopic set against the kind of big backdrops, and I think that's probably a fair criticism. Although I'm so biased because I love those backdrops. They're part of my childhood, and visiting there on holiday, that I can just soak them up all day, but not everybody can. So, yeah, it's funny that way.
Well, I saw the film projected in 70 millimeter probably about 10, 12, 13 years ago at the Academy here, the Samuel Goldwyn Theater at the
Yeah,
Academy, and it was one of the most transcendent things I've ever seen. I mean, I had only seen the film in 35 or on video before, and this was my first time seeing it the way it was meant to be seen, the way it had been originally seen, and it was. I've never seen the beauty of Ireland captured more vigorously or vibrantly.
yeah.
It was really really extraordinary, and I think the film has aged well. To
Wait,
be
wait,
honest, it's
wait,
it's it's
wait,
it's interesting.
wait.
Yeah,
Let me interrupt you there for a second, okay? Because I went to see it in LA as
yeah,
well, at the Academy Samuel Goldwyn Theatre on the 15th of
yep.
November, 2002. Were you there?
W- I was there, so we were there at the same screening. That was it. Yes.
And now it's taken us best part of 20 years to actually have a conversation. You
Yeah.
know,
No, that's great. No, that was it. Yeah, I didn't think it was that long ago, but it was. It was 2002. Yeah, for sure.
because that was the day that they one of the Mills's daughters was there, Harriet or Juliet, or one of she was introduced. Do you remember that? No.
Yeah, that was an amazing screening. It was just luminous, and as I understand it, I think that was I that I think Robert Harris told me that was an answer print, but I'm not quite sure. But still, I mean, it was extraordinary. And the thing that I find most interesting too, in that respect, is that it was the last of the great 70 millimeter films shot in '65 until Far and Away with Tom Cruise and Nicole Kidman, which was also Irish, and which I saw at the Cannes Film Festival when it came around. But this film not only ended Lean's career through the '70s and into the beginning of the '80s, but it ended the 70 millimeter moment that was so dominant in the 1960s. It really was the last of a certain breed of film, and I don't think it meant to be, but it wound up being. Um, do you think that in many respects that the film's box office failure at the time uh, reverberated in that way? Did it sort of send a chill down some people's spines about trying to go and make another one of these big widescreen epics?
Um, Look, I'm probably not the best person to sort of answer that, except to say that making a movie in 70 millimeter, 65 to 70 millimeter, it's incredibly expensive. You know, you've got to you need massive lighting. This is what Lean found. He had to get in these huge brute. They called them brutes at the time. Um, these things weighed, they were a ton. They weighed a ton. So everything was bigger. The lamps, the stands, the track that it ran on, the cranes, everything was just like a enormous logistical, exercise. Um, he had shot Zhivago in 35 millimeter, and won, and it had won Oscars for Freddie Young, who was the director of photography, the cameraman. Young won an Oscar for virtually every Lean movie he worked on, including Ryan's Daughter. And Young was sort of happy enough with 35 millimeter, but David Lean was insistent on 70 millimeter. I think partly because he had got to the stage where he could call the shots exactly as he wanted to do it, and he wanted to go back to the 70 mil that he had shot Lawrence of Arabia with. Um, and everything was contracting, post Ryan's Daughter, as we talked about earlier with the budgets for films. Sort of the power of television was enormous. Um, 70 millimeter meant nothing, and it didn't work for television, does it? You'll know as well as I would, Wade. So I suppose a lot of the screens were probably changing as well. You need a massive screen to show that kind of wide format, don't you? Rather than a square
True.
screen,
Yes.
you need a massive, almost like a letterbox kind of screen. So yeah, it's I think there was other things came in, wasn't there? Other kind of fads came in terms of the way that they shot film, and there was all sorts of Panavision and all sorts of things being. I'm not sure I've got the name right there, but it was a I think probably, as you say, the logistics and the expense of shooting in 7 millimeter, 70 millimeter were enormous, and probably Ryan's Daughter. It wasn't a particularly successful movie, and so probably people felt it was an object lesson in excessive spending, and they moved away from that form of shooting.
How many of the people involved are still alive? I know Sarah Miles is still alive and bounces around between Europe and here in Los Angeles, if I've understood correctly. But is Sarah really the last, or are there any key figures that are still with us?
Uh, Sarah is very alive and kicking for sure. Yeah, she is. She's a very vigorous 78, 79-year-old woman, in great health. I saw her about a year ago, the last time, down in her lovely sort of manor house in West Sussex, uh, south of London, um, where I think she still nurtures plans to do a sequel to Ryan's Daughter, um, which she's been working on. Um, Now, that's that's a kind of a semi-secret, and I'm not sure if it's ever going to happen. Um, but she, so she kind of, no, I think she has spent some time in her life. She's really the last big figure alive, Wade, really, from the film. Sadly, Christopher Jones
Yeah.
died about 7 or 8 years ago. Mitchum died in sort of 1997. I'm trying to think of anybody else really who's kind of a star or kind of and really no, they're sadly they've all parted. But I did speak to Christopher when I went to Los Angeles back in 2002, and I spoke to John Mills before he died, and and so and some of the Irish actors as well. There's a few of the Irish actors are still alive, but no, really, Sarah, as you say, Sarah is really the last living um, the living reminder of the film. Except if you consider Olivia Hussey, who wasn't in the film but was Christopher Jones's girlfriend when he was shooting Ryan's daughter. Olivia Hussey, the star of Romeo and Juliet, around that time. That's another story. So yes, it's great. Sarah's still alive. Yeah.
And I have to say too, that is one of the things that I most enjoyed are the little tangential stories about how this connects everything. Ryan's daughter winds up being a very strange hub to a lot of other goings on that Christopher Jones's managers that they while they a gay couple who were on kind of on holiday more or less during the film, that they had rented out their house to Roman Polanski and Sharon Tate, and suddenly all of when you share those anecdotes, it enlarges the world of Ryan's daughter. Or when Pedro heads to Los Angeles to try to talk Marlon Brando into taking the part that Christopher Jones eventually took, and you have a very, very funny anecdote about that as well. I mean, they're all of these wonderful peripheral stories that just sort of paint a picture not just of this production, but of Hollywood at this very eccentric moment of time when it was changing from the culture of the studios to a bit more of a lazy kind of counterculture independent world of the late 60s and 70s. It really does seem to be this transitional moment, and many of them, I mean, Christopher Jones certainly, because he had made a lot of these very popular counterculture films, but a lot of them, like Lean, weren't really ready for that change. And I think you paint that world very, very beautifully, and you paint that moment in time very, very vibrantly as well.
Yeah, no, it was. I was kind of hoping the book would come out in '69 rather than 1970, because I was so taken by that whole tragedy of the Manson family murders of Tate
Yeah,
and her friends, and in that house in Cielo Drive, is that if that's how you pronounce it, and
yep,
of
yep,
course. It's all come up again in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. We've just, where if you look at Once Upon a Time in Hollywood closely, you see all the references to Christopher Jones in that film. You know, Tarantino's obsessed by Christopher Jones. He tried to
yeah,
get Christopher Jones to play a part in Pulp Fiction, the part of Zed, which had no attraction for Jones because it was a pretty gory part. But yeah, the it's sort of all these troubles kind of coming in, are kind of impacting on. They're spending so long in Dingle, and all these troubles are coming in and out. Like you have the trouble up in Northern Ireland just starting off. Um, so you've got the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends, affecting what's happening in Ryan, thousands of miles away in a small little village in Ireland, because Christopher Jones was kind of was said to be having an affair with Sharon, not necessarily at that time, but a few months previously, and was a good friend of Sharon Tate's, and it kind of really messed his head, and really affected him in terms of the shooting of Ryan's daughter. He had a lot of mental problems around that time, and Liam couldn't found it very difficult working with them, um, and I didn't really sort of have any sympathy for the fact that this was um, a very kind of confused young man, going through a difficult period, making the biggest movie of his life. As you said, he had made a few counterculture movies, and he made a movie called The Looking Glass War. But this was his big kind of break, getting this part in Ryan's Daughter, Christopher Jones, who kind of who was really struggling to get up to the task, frankly, and kind of delayed the movie a lot because they had so many problems getting him to play the part properly, and yeah, it didn't help like that the murders of Sharon Tate and her friends really badly affected Christopher Jones, and he also crashed his car, his Ferrari, as you probably remember. Almost lost his
Yeah.
life. Some people said he was trying to commit suicide. I spoke to Christopher, and he strongly denied that. And I found Christopher a very engaging individual, I have to say. Yeah. So and then when the movie's over, Christopher goes back and lives in that same house. Lived in Cielo Drive, in the lodge, in the sort of gate lodge, and he kind of he dropped out. He became part of the counterculture himself. He became a kind of like a hippie, even though he never really embraced that particular movement up till that time. So the Christopher Jones story is one of the most interesting parts of the book. What happened to Christopher Jones, and um, and perhaps I'm not saying Ryan's Daughter was cursed. I mean it's just too flippant to say that. But there was two people going into that movie who were supposed to become superstars. One of them was Sarah Miles, and one of them was Christopher Jones, and both of their careers kind of declined very, very sharply after that. Christopher virtually never made another movie again, and Sarah had a huge problem post Ryan's Daughter over the death of David Whiting, her manager. When they were shooting a
Right.
film in over in Arizona, um, and kind of she said she became blacklisted by Hollywood over that. I think they just did. I think Hollywood just couldn't cope with Sarah. She was too wild. She was too much of a she was too much of an alternative kind of character, really. And yeah, so that was one of the legacies of Ryan's Daughter, was the fact that those two actors really kind of it didn't work for them, frankly. That's sort of part of the reason as to why Ryan's Daughter is in some ways seen as a bit of a failure.
And it's funny because again, I think the film has aged beautifully with time. I think unless you know all of these backstories to it, unless you know all of the problems, I think watching it today, it just feels like a wonderful, wonderful throwback to a kind of film that just doesn't exist anymore. And there's something sort of deliriously romantic about it. And again, unless you know all of the problems, you would never see them necessarily on the screen, at least not with our 50 years of hindsight. Um, but there's also, I think you do a much better job of sort of painting a picture of that moment later on when the National Society of Film Critics had Lean as a guest, and they all basically ganged up and attacked him, which shows up in obviously all the other Lean biographies and most significantly in the Brownlow. But you really paint it much more in detail here. And it's interesting because Richard Schickel, being the one who sort of attacked Lean initially, Schickel was a colleague of ours for many years before he passed with the LA Film Critics as well. So I got to know him to as well as I think anybody could get to know Dick Schickel, who was by that point was a pretty crusty curmudgeon. But I think what comes out the way that you write it is perhaps that there was not as much ill intent as Lean may have perceived. And I could certainly, having known Schickel, I could see that when the very sort of famous dig that he takes at Lean initially, I could almost see Schickel thinking that he was being cute and perhaps adorably impertinent, and not necessarily understanding that someone would take that as an insult.
Yeah.
So I mean, again, it's really, you paint that picture very, very well as well. Do you also feel that perhaps the film has aged much better, and that we see it through, not to pun intended, but rose-colored glasses?
Yeah, I do. I totally take your point about the fact that they really don't make movies like that anymore, and it still looks absolutely stunning. It's visually it's just incredibly powerful film, and it's quite slow moving, but I think it's really kind of it really takes you to a different world completely. And even as an Irishman, I'd say that. I think the ending, they didn't quite get the ending right, but we can forgive them that. I think with the Schickel thing, funny because Steven Silverman is the guy who kind of, who I think is probably a colleague of yours as well. Like
Yeah, I
Stephen
know
would be an
Stephen well.
interesting guy to talk to about, because Lean. It was in Stephen's book on David Lean that Lean really laid into Schickel over that meeting in the Algonquin Hotel in New York in November 1970. Uh, he said that Schickel had said, how could the guy who directed Lawrence of Arabia make this pile of shit? Um, which really would be which would be an insulting thing for anybody to say to Lean. Um, Schickel argued that Schickel argued that's not how the meeting opened, as Lean claimed. Lean claimed that was part of Schickel's opening remarks. Schickel had a different memory of it, and he said that he made that remark or a similar remark maybe an hour into the meeting when said he was trying to sum up what the kind of critics were saying to David. And Schickel said that he didn't use the word shit. He used the word piece of bullshit. And 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 um, and Schickel argued strongly in a letter to Brownlow, Lean's biographer, that bullshit is not as kind of offensive a word, certainly in an American context, as shit is. So I hope you don't mind me using that kind of language. It's
Oh
important.
no,
No, yeah,
it's the historical record.
yeah.
I have to say, having been on many email chains with Richard Schickel over the years, I am inclined to take Lean's version of that story much
Really?
more
Oh,
so.
yeah.
Richard Schickel's,
Wow.
yeah, Schickel's. I mean, well, a lot of us have saved those email chains for posterity because Schickel's forethought was. Even if he was not being malicious, his lack of forethought certainly comes through. There's an instinctual kind of curmudgeonliness to
What's
him
it?
that
Yeah.
you sort of have to sometimes you read twice and go, did he really just write that to the whole group? And in fact, he did.
Well,
So
at the
none
end,
of that surprises me in the least.
well, Lean's. I took Schickel's side slightly because Lean would kind of famously kind of forget things that he didn't like or didn't, and slightly twists, the facts to suit himself. I think on some occasions, and his recollection of things wasn't always 100%. But I mean, probably the main villain of that piece, in inverted commas, and villain inverted, was Pauline Kael. She was the most
Sure.
vituperative, uh, and and um, and was uh,
Yeah.
she was the most vituperative, and she was completely unapologetic about that. Um,
Which is certainly in keeping with her character.
yeah, exactly. And so so she was apparently the one who was kind of the most offensive, really, if you will. And I think and Lean certainly remembered all that, but he kind of found Kale to be quite an attractive woman as well. So, which probably not all directors would share that opinion. But yeah, she I don't suppose you didn't know Pauline Kael as well, did you? Probably knew her as well, Wade.
I did not know Pauline Kael, but a number of my colleagues are considered what they call Paulines, or there's a term for it that's escaping me right now. But
Okay.
they were acolytes of hers and
Oh
kind
well,
of came
yeah,
out from under her thumb.
yeah,
A radio colleague of mine, Peter Rayner, who writes for the Christian Science Monitor, was one of her close associates as well. So I've heard many stories about Pauline, certainly
yeah.
firsthand,
Mm.
secondhand.
I mean,
Yeah.
yeah. Anyway, look, I'm digressing slightly, but she would have she wouldn't have held back, no doubt. She of course she was kind of like, I think she prided herself. I think is she a New Yorker? I'm not sure, but she was very much of that. She went out, she left the meeting, and she kind of um, and Lean's girlfriend, later to be wife, who we talked about before, Sandy Lean. was waiting outside along with a guy called Nat Weiss. You probably heard of him, of MGM, an MGM publicist, and his wife. And Cale sort of grabbed Sandy by the hand and said, "You got to come into this meeting. You know, we need some dames in here. You know, we need some. There's too much testosterone, you know, pouring around in there. We need to sort of lighten the mood a bit. You know." And she tried to drag Sandy Holtz, as she was at the time, into the sort of banqueting hall where they were having the meeting, and Sandy was having none of it. So that was you know, I mean, I think there would have been a lot of the critics would have there would have been a lot of kind of bitchiness among the critics as well, and I think that you know, Schickel certainly felt that Cale was kind of monstering the whole meeting, you know, and perhaps that might be, you know, I can well believe that to be the case.
Paul, thank you again, and I will encourage all of our listeners to definitely pick this book up. It is a wonderful, wonderful lesson in filmmaking and in an era bygone. Making Ryan's Daughter: The Myths, Madness, and Mastery by Paul Benedict Rowan.